Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Sophia, and in recent years, diversity, equity, and inclusion, also known as DEI, has become one of the most debated topics in the workplace and public conversations. A lot of that debate comes from misunderstanding about what it actually is and what it's not. But in the middle of all that controversy, I think something important got lost. And that's why I chose this topic and why I want to talk to you today about what it actually is, what the purpose of DEI is in how organizations hire, evaluate, and support people. I want to break that down clearly what DEI really means, why it exists, and how it actually works in practice. This is a presentation based on the summary of critiquing the backlash against wokeness in defense of DEI scholarship and practice, published on the journal Academy of Management Perspectives. To understand the conversation, we need to define what DEI actually means. D stands for diversity, refers to the differences we bring as individuals, our background, identities, and experiences. For example, I identify as a queer female Hispanic migrant. Someone else might have a completely different background, and those differences shape how we think, communicate, and approach problems. E stands for equity. Focuses on fairness, meaning removing barriers so people can access the same opportunities. For example, if two employees have the same role, but one has less access to mentorship or flexible scheduling due to the personal responsibilities, equity means providing the support needed so both can succeed equally. And lastly, I stands for inclusion. It's what happens after hiring, whether people feel valued, respected, and able to contribute. For example, it's not just about being invited to a meeting, but feeling comfortable sharing your ideas and knowing that they will be heard and considered. Well, now that we have grounded the definition, the next question is, why did DEI become so important in the first place? DEI didn't emerge as a trend or corporate strategy. It developed from a long history of inequality in workplace and society. It is rooted in the civil rights movement and equal opportunity laws designed to address discrimination in hiring and employment. At first, organizations focused mainly on the compliance, right, following the law. But over time, it became clear that legal compliance alone does not guarantee fairness in practice. This realization is what shifted DI into something broader and what it is today, a focus on system, behavior, and workforce culture. And it leads directly into where DI shows up the most clearly, which is the hiring process. When companies hire, they usually look at two main things: qualifications and likelihood of success in the role. Qualifications are the more measurable factors, things like our education, certifications, technical skills, and experience. For example, when hiring an interpreter at my former company, candidates were required to be fluent in another language other than English. However, someone could stand out more if they had formal training or certifications. Because of that, qualifications tend to be the more objective part of the process. The second factor is likelihood of success, which is more subjective. This includes things like communication skills, adaptability, how well someone performs under pressure, and just the overall fit of the candidate into the company's culture. Two candidates may have the same qualifications but perform very different in an interview based on how they communicate or solve problems. And this is where something less visible starts to play a role. It's called subconscious bias. Even when we think we are being fair, we all have automatic preferences shaped by our own experiences and environment. In a well known study, researchers sent out identical resumes but only changed out the names. Applicants with names like Emily or Greg received about 50% more callbacks than those called Lakeisha or Jamal, even though their qualifications were exactly the same. Because of these findings, many companies have actually now used blind resume screening, where names and identifying information are removed from the applications. This helps ensure that candidates are evaluated based only on their skills and experience, not on assumptions tied to their identity. And that's a problem with bias. It doesn't reflect about actual ability, but it reflects familiarity. This is why DEI is important in hiring. It doesn't change the standards, but it helps structure the process. When organizations use consistent interviewing questions, standard evaluations, and blind screening practices, they reduce the space where bias can influence decisions. So the goal is not actually to remove human judgment, but to make sure that judgment is guided by fairness. This is where a lot of the confusion about DEI really shows up. There is a common belief that DEI is simply about meeting diversity numbers, filling out quotas, and just filling out a checklist. But that's not what it's actually meant to do. That misunderstanding usually comes from how DEI has been seen in the past and how it's been presented over time, not what it actually is. In the past, some equal opportunity policies were designed with goals to improve representation. Even though these were not strict hiring quotas, they were often remembered as such. That history has shaped how people interpret modern day DEI efforts. Now, another reason is that many companies report diversity data publicly. When people see numbers and benchmarks, it creates that impression that hiring decisions are being made on targets rather than based on qualifications. And finally, DEI is often discussed in political or media contexts where it gets oversimplified into slogans like quotas, forced diversity, wokeness, which again doesn't really reflect how it actually works in practice. In reality, most DEI frameworks are not about forcing outcomes. They're about improving processes so that the hiring, evaluation, promotion decisions are fair and based on merit, not bias, which is actually something we're going to discuss in the upcoming slides. But DEI doesn't stop when someone is hired. In fact, that's actually when the more important part begins. A workplace can be diverse on paper, but still not inclusive in practice. Inclusion is what determines whether people actually feel like they belong inside the organization. That shows up in leadership accountability, how policies are applied, whether employees feel safe speaking up, contributing ideas, and growing professionally. When inclusion is done well, employees are not only more engaged, but they are more likely to stay, contribute, and grow within the organization over time. So, inclusion is not an extra layer added at the end, it is what makes diversity meaningful in the first place. And I actually experienced this firsthand in a different way that challenged my assumptions. I'm going to give you the real life example. At my previous company, we hired a new interpreter who had a physical disability that affected his hands. Now, in our role as interpreters, note taking is extremely important. It's something we rely on heavily during calls. So, honestly, my initial assumption was that he might struggle in the role because of that. He didn't request any accommodations, so we trained him exactly like we trained everyone else. And at the end, he surprised me. When he moved on to operations, he didn't just meet the expectations, he succeeded. And over time, he actually came back to us and became a coach. That experience really challenged my assumptions. What I thought might be a limitation had nothing to do with his actual ability to succeed. And that is exactly why DEI matters in the workplace. It reminds us that inclusion is not about the assumptions, it's about giving people equal opportunity to demonstrate what they're capable of. So, when we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, DEI is not just a workplace initiative or a trending topic. It's really about how decisions are made, who gets considered, who gets opportunities, and how fairness is defined in real systems. At its core, DEI is not about changing standards. It's about making sure that the standards are applied fairly and consistently without bias influencing outcomes. And when that happens, organizations don't just become more diverse, they become accurate in their hiring, more effective in their teams, and ultimately more fair in how people experience the workplace. I believe this was a very insightful and great article to read. If you're interested in learning more, here is my reference. Thank you, everybody.